Inshallah, what we'll do is we'll first have a recitation in one of the different and many various ways of recitations of the Quran. Thereafter, we're going to have, as you guys can see the PowerPoint slides, we're going to have a few different discussions regarding the history and some terminology regarding the science. And then, inshallah, then there will be another demonstration of how to recite multiple ways of the Qira'aat, inshallah. And towards the end, if there are any questions, inshallah, we can try to give some time to discuss whatever we need further clarification.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. عبس وتولى أن جاءه الأعمى وما يدريك لعله يزكى أو يذكر فتنفعه الذكرى أما من استغنى فأنت له تصدى وما عليك ألا يزكى وأما من جاءك يسعى وهو يخشى فأنت عنه تنهى كلا إنها تذكرة فمن شاء ذكره في صحف مكرمة مرفوعة مطهرة بأيدي سفرة كرام بررة قتل الإنسان ما أكفره من أي شيء خلقه من نطفة خلقه فقدره ثم السبيل يسره ثم أماته فأقبره ثم إذا شاء أنشره كلا لما يقض ما أمره فلينظر الإنسان إلى طعامه إنا صببنا الماء صبا ثم شققنا الأرض شقا فأنبتنا فيها حبا وعنبا وقضبا وزيتونا ونخلا وحدائق غلبا وفاكهة وأبا متاعا لكم ولأنعامكم فإذا جاءت الصاخة يوم يفر المرء من أخيه وأمه وأبيه وصاحبته وبنيه لكل امرئ منهم يومئذ شأن يغنيه وجوه يومئذ مسفرة ضاحكة مستبشرة ووجوه يومئذ عليها غبرة ترهقها قترة أولئك هم الكفرة الفجرة.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم. So many of us, we might have never heard of other qira'at before. What Faisal just read, some of them might have sounded unfamiliar or strange to us, but we must keep in mind that all of these are part of the Quran, and they were all transmitted from the Sahaba, from the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, who got it from Jibreel alayhi salam, who got it from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, just as we might have felt like, I've never heard this before, similarly, a incident occurred with Umar radiallahu anhu, that he was praying behind Hisham bin Hakim bin Hizam radiallahu anhu, and he was reading Surah Al-Furqan. And Umar radiallahu anhu was wondering, why is he reading like this? I've never heard this before. The way it was taught to me was completely different. So he was about to get up and grab him in the middle of the salah, but then he waited until the end of the salah, and then he went to him and he grabbed him by his shirt and he brought him to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he told him that this person is not reciting the Quran properly. Why is he reading like this? So then Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he asked Hisham bin Hakim bin Hizam radiallahu anhu, he asked him that recite however you recited in the salah, and then he recited to him. And then Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he told him, this is how it was revealed, that you're reading correctly. That's how it was revealed. And then he told Umar radiallahu anhu that recite it as you were taught, as you recited. And then he recited as the way he used to recite normally. And then he told him, Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam told him that this is also correct. So then, and then what did he say? He said, هكذا أنزل إن القرآن أنزل على 7 أحرف فاقرأوا ما تيسر منه. That this is how it was revealed. The Quran has been revealed in 7 ahruf, in seven different ways, or 7 different methods of recitation. So recite whichever of them is easy for you. And now there are many different meanings of sab'atu ahruf that the scholars have built into, which we might discuss towards the end of the presentation, inshallah. But for now, we learned from this hadith a few main parameters, right? Number 1, we learned that these are all different qira'at, that these are established from Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that these are sanctioned by him. And he taught different qira'at to different sahaba, whom they then took it, and then they passed it on to their students, and they have all now reached us. And all of them are considered Quran. So whichever qira'ah one recites, they'll get the same reward, right? As it comes in the hadith, that for every single letter that person reads, they get 10 hasanat. So whichever qira'ah they read, they're all considered Quran. They can all be recited in salah. And similarly, if anyone denies any part of the Quran, that will put their iman in stake. Similarly, if anyone denies any part of these qira'at, then their iman is in question as well. And then one very important point is that all of the qira'at, they're not contradictory to each other. They're just different ways of reciting. Right? So there's they're based on different dialects, for example. It's just different ways of conveying different meanings, but the meanings are not contradictory. In some cases, the meaning is different, but it's very slight differences, slight variations that they just give a different or additional meaning. It's not a opposite meaning. And then there are several benefits to these qira'at, as one of them is the different meanings that are given. But another benefit that is found in the qira'at is that different people, like for example in the Arabs, there were many different tribes, right? And they had different ways of speaking Arabic. So some words or some ways might be different and difficult for them to pronounce. That's why the Quran was revealed in different ways, so that all these people, they can recite the Quran with ease. So this hadith, Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, يا جبريل إني بعثت إلى أمة الأميين منهم العجوز والشيخ الكبير والغلام والجارية والرجل الذي لم يقرأ كتاب الفقه. That I've been sent to a people, an unlettered nation, right? Because most of the Arabs, they did not know how to read or write. There's elderly women, there's elderly men, there's young children, young girls, and there's some people that have never read any book before, so they don't know how to read or write. So they might have some difficulty pronouncing certain things. So then Jibreel alayhi salam told him, Ya Muhammad, inna al-Qur'ana unzila ala 7 ahruf. That the Quran indeed has been revealed upon 7 ahruf, 7 notes. So that's the first benefit, that it's easy for many people to recite the Quran from various different tribes, different dialects that they might have. It caters to those different dialects. And then another added benefit is that the irjaz of the Quran, that the Quran is a miracle of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So it's subhanAllah, one miracle is just the fact that it's preserved. The other books that Tawrah, the Injil, they were not preserved to their fullest extent. And there was tahqiq that happened. People changed wordings, they changed the meanings of them. But the Quran, it was preserved not only just one way, but all the different modes of recitation were preserved. That just adds to the i'jaz of the Quran. And another additional miraculous aspect is that the Quran, there's one lesson, there's one way of writing it. Right? That we've probably heard about the Muslim Uthman, that he sent different masahif to the different cities of the Muslims when he compiled the Mus'haf. It's a longer discussion, we're not going to that right now, but the Quran, it has the same lesson, the same writing. Back then there was no harakat, you see this fatha al nakasa, there was none of that. But, so the Quran, it accommodates all of these qira'at, because even if there's a change in, for example, letters, because there was no dots written in the Mus'haf back then, so the Quran accommodates for all these different qira'at, and they were all preserved through the Sahaba, through the Tabi'un, and those that came after them. And finally, it sets the Quran apart from other, as I mentioned, the other books, first of all, they were not preserved, but second of all, they were also only revealed in one way. But the Quran, it was revealed in so many different ways, and it was also, all of them were also preserved. And then, so as I mentioned, the first thing was Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. He learned from Jibreel Alayhi Salam. He learned all of the ways of reciting from Jibreel Alayhi Salam. And then in the last Ramadan, before he passed away, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he would read the Quran to Jibreel Alayhi Salam once every Ramadan, but in the last Ramadan, he recited it twice. And in this recitation, all of the differences, all of the different ways of reciting were included. So that is the final Quran that was then passed on to us. And then the time of the Sahaba, they learned from the Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, like I mentioned before. Uthman, he mentioned that he learned the Surah Al-Quran a different way. And then Hisham bin Hakim bin Hizam, he learned it a different way. So he would teach different qira'at or different ways of reciting to different Sahaba. And then these Sahaba, they would pass it on to their students, the Tabi'un. And then eventually, these 10 canonical reciters, which we'll discuss, the 10 qira'at, they were codified, and then books are written about them. For example, Ibn Jazari, he's like one of the main authors in this science, and he compiled all of the 10 qira'at in his An-Nashr al-Qira'at al-Ashr, and there are many different works on the qira'at, so that the codification of the science occurred later on. And then, so here's example timeline. So from Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, who learned from Jibreel Alayhi Salam, who learned from Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, and revealed it to Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. There were different Sahaba. For example, these are just a few Sahaba that are more famous in their transmission of the Quran. Uthman bin Affan radiallahu ta'ala anhu, Ali bin Abi Talib, Ubay bin Ka'b radiallahu ta'ala anhu, Abdullah bin Mas'ud radiallahu ta'ala anhu, and Zayd bin Thabit radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And then these Sahaba, they passed down to their students, the Tabi'un. For example, Abu Abdurrahman al-Sulami, he learned it from all of these Sahaba. He learned the Quran from all of these Sahaba, and Zayd bin Quraysh also learned from many of these Sahaba. These are Tabi'un, who then passed it on to their students until they reached the Qur'aa. So Asim is one of the 10 Qur'aa, and the Qira'ah that we read is Hafs an Asim. So Asim has two students, Hafs and Shu'ba. So there are 10 different Qur'aa, and each one of them, which we'll discuss more in detail later, has two students, or two individuals, two scholars that transmit that Qira'ah from him. So that's why there's a total of 20 different ways per se. And then, so yeah, I mentioned the Qari, there's 10 Qur'aa. So Qari is when the recitation is attributed to one of the 7 or 10 reciters whose recitations meet the conditions of acceptance that we mentioned. So the conditions that, I don't think we mentioned it in detail, but it has to match the lesson of the Quran. The way the Quran is written, it has to match the lesson. And it has to be narrated to us with tawatur. Tawatur is when there's no possibility of anyone fabricating. It's such a large number of people narrating it that there's no possibility that all these people got together and colluded to make up a lie. And then a riwayah or a rawi is the one who narrates from that body. So for example, as I mentioned before, Hafs from Asim. So Asim has two students, Hafs and Shu'ba, and the riwayah that we normally read throughout the world is very common is Hafs and Asim. So yeah, as I mentioned, Asim has two students, Shu'ba and Hafs. And then Shu'ba and Hafs are both rawis of the Qari Asim. And then these are all 10 Qur'aa. So Nafi' al-Madani, he has two students, Qalun and Wajh. And then Ibn Kathir al-Makki, he has Basi and Umbul as his two ravis. And then Abu Amr al-Basri, his two transmitters are Duli and Susi. And Abu Amr al-Shami, Ibn Amr al-Shami, his two transmitters are Hisham and Ibn Ghazwan. And then Asim al-Kufi has Shu'ba and Hafs. And Hafs is the most common, as you mentioned, the one that we read normally, Hafs and Asim. Then Hamza, he has Khalaf and Khalad. Kisai, he has Abu Harith and Duli al-Kisai. So Duli al-Kisai and Abu Amr al-Basri, they're the same person. He narrates from both Abu Amr al-Basri and also al-Kisai. And then Abu Ja'far has Ibn Waldan and Ibn Jamaz. And then Yaqub al-Hadrami has Rawh and Uwais. And Khalaf al-Ashir, he also narrates from Hamza, but he also narrates to his students, Idris and Ishaq. And then, so there are different types of differences. For example, some are consistent throughout the Quran. Like, for example, what you just heard, لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مِّنْهُمْ يَوْمَئِذٍ شَأْنٌ يُغْنِيهِ. So, مِنْهُمْ, عَلَيْهِمْ, those type of things, they are consistent throughout the entire Quran. So, for example, Ibn Kathir al-Makki, his two ravis, he will do عَلَيْهِمْ. Like, صِرَاطَ الَّذِينَ أَنْعَمْتَ عَلَيْهِمْ غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ. So, but then there are some differences that are not consistent throughout the entire Quran. Like, for example, Maliki Yawmiddin, that's just one place in the Quran where there's difference. And then خَطِيئَاتِهِمْ خَطَايَاهُمْ, sometimes in Hafsina خَطِيئَاتِهِمْ, and then in other qira'at it's خَطَايَاهُمْ. So that's a difference that's not consistent throughout the entire Quran. It's just in specific places that it occurs. And then these are just some more examples of differences so these are examples of usul that are consistent rules throughout the different qurra. So for example, there's imada, one najmi ida hawi. We'll hear a little bit more towards the end of these differences. For example, Hamza and Kisai, Hamza over here and Kisai, they do imada, which is instead of one najmi ida hawa, they do one najmi ida hawi. And then صلة من جمع, we already discussed that, like عليهم تنذرهم. Ibn Kathir al-Makki does that. And then Naql, for example, instead of وَبِالْآخِرَةِ هُمْ يُوقِنُونَ, Welsh, Imam Welsh from from Nafir, he does وَبِالْآخِرَةِ instead of وَبِالْآخِرَةِ. And then Seth, for example, Hamza does وَبِالْآخِرَةِ, instead of وَبِالْآخِرَةِ, he does وَبِالْآخِرَةِ. And then Tasheed, instead of saying أَنذَرْتَهُمْ, like in Hafs, we pronounce both hamzas clearly. He does different qurra, they do the second hamza, they don't pronounce it very clearly. And then idgham kabir, instead of, so in Hafs we read وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ آمِنُوا. But in Susi, for example, who does idgham kabir, he reads وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ آمِنُوا. And then, as we mentioned, sab'atu ahruf. So the Quran was revealed in sab'atu ahruf. So what does that mean? So the scholars have many different opinions on what sab'atu ahruf means. One of the opinions is that sab'a in Arabic, 7 is used to mean kathra, to mean a lot. So for example, if you say, I have 1,000,000 of something, right? So similarly, the Arab, they will use 7 and 70 and 700 and so on to denote kathra, to denote a large number of something. So in that case, sab'atu ahruf just means that there's many ways of reciting, not limited to 7. And another way of interpreting it is that sab'atu ahruf refers to 7 categories of differences, around which the differences of the qira'at revolve. For example, there's differences in nouns, right? If a noun might be plural, might be singular. Or there's differences in verbs. It might be past tense instead of present, or present instead of past tense. Or there's a third person instead of second person, for example. And then there's the third category is differences in grammatical or rhetorical structure. So the sentence might be structured differently, or there's an addition or omission of a word. So the different masahif that were sent out by they might have contained, like for example, in Surah Tawbah, in Hafs we read تجري تحت الأنهار. But in other qira'at, some of them it's تجري من تحتها الأنهار. Like throughout the rest of the Quran, it's تجري من تحتها الأنهار. But in Hafs we read تجري تحتها الأنهار. And then differences in word order. For example, one word might come, it's the same word, but it might come before a different word, before the word after it. And then there might be a bad word, one word is replaced by another. And then the final difference is the difference in dialect. For example, when najmi ila hawa instead of hawa, hawa, that's a difference in dialect or pronunciation, but the meaning is the exact same. And then there are many different examples of narration that mention that Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he also recited in these different qira'at. And for example, there's the verse, قُلْ بِفَضْلِ اللَّهِ وَبِرَحْمَتِهِ فَبِذَلِكَ فَلْيَفْرَحُوا هُوَ خَيْرٌ مِّمَّا يَجْمَعُونَ. So in a different qira'at, هُوَ خَيْرٌ مِّمَّا تَجْمَعُونَ. So it's narrated that he narrates that Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he read تَجْمَعُونَ. Same with Malik Yawmiddin, Malik Yawmiddin. There's in the hadith books you'll find narrations that mention that he read Malik Yawmiddin sometimes, and sometimes it's mentioned that he read Malik Yawmiddin. So every single one of these differences is transmitted from the Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and it is part of the Quran. And there's another example that's mentioned in the hadith books is إِنَّهُ عَمَلٌ غَيْرُ صَالِحٍ, regarding Nuh alayhi salam and his son. إِنَّهُ عَمَلٌ غَيْرُ صَالِحٍ. In Hafs we read إِنَّهُ عَمَلٌ غَيْرُ صَالِحٍ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told Nuh alayhi salam that your son is not from your family because إِنَّهُ عَمَلٌ غَيْرُ صَالِحٍ, which literally means he is a non-righteous action. Which is just to emphasize that his actions were very unrighteous. But in a different qira'ah, it is إِنَّهُ عَمِلَ غَيْرَ صَالِحٍ. So instead of a nominal sentence, a verbal sentence. That is إِنَّهُ عَمِلَ غَيْرَ صَالِحٍ. Means indeed he did a wrong action. Another example is وَكَتَبْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ فِيهَا أَنَّ النَّفْسَ بِالنَّفْسِ وَالْعَيْنُ بِالْعَيْنِ. So for example, in Kisa'i he reads وَالْعَيْنُ بِالْعَيْنِ, whereas in Hafs we read وَالْعَيْنَ بِالْعَيْنِ. And we must understand that all of these qira'at are part of the Quran, right? And they have all been transmitted from the Sahaba, from the Tabi'un, from Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And so whenever we hear maybe a different recitation in Salah, for example, we should not be quick to judge it or say, what is this person reciting? Because all of these are considered Quran. So if we say, what is this person reciting, then we'll be disrespecting the Quran, and we may even fall into more grave things, because if someone rejects part of the Quran, then they are at risk of having committed kufr. So the purpose of this presentation was just to show that all these qira'at are valid, they're established from Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and just to give a few examples of differences that may occur. And then inshallah we'll have a few more examples very quick.
I just wanted to emphasize one point, inshallah. So as you can see, the first or second hadith that we touched upon, Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam had a lot of consideration for the ummah at large, right? So Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said, فِيهِمُ الضَّعِيفُ وَالشَّيْخُ الْكَبِيرُ إِنَّ أُمَّتِي لَا تُطِيقُ ذَلِكَ. Right? My ummah is not able to recite in such a manner because there's a variety of people, right? And most of us who speak a different language, we can attest to this. For the Arabs in the crowd, we can all attest to the fact that there are different lahajats, between the Moroccans and the Syrians and the Egyptians. And for the Urdu speakers as well, there's the same, right, amongst the different tribes. Similarly, I'm from Ethiopia, so we have the same sort of concept. So we know that depending on the language that you're speaking, we have this concept of one tribe speaking in a certain way and another tribe speaking in a different way. And for one tribe, it may be easier to pronounce a certain thing, whereas for another tribe, it may be much more difficult. And to really drive in the point, one of the things that we talked about over here was, let's just focus on one thing. Let's say the hamza, right? In the Arabic language, the letter hamza, for those who have studied tajweed, knows that there are certain qualities that it possesses. One of them is shidda, right? Which is a man or salt, meaning that the voice, when we pronounce the word hamza, is trapped, right? So the hamza is a very strong letter, right? And for many of us too, when we recite the Quran, sometimes we don't really do adat, we don't really do pronunciation of that letter that well. So the same was for certain tribes of the Arabs, right? So the hamza was a very difficult letter for certain tribes to pronounce. Even to the extent that the Quraysh, the same tribe that the Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was from, they wouldn't pronounce the hamza with what we call tahqiq. Tahqiq meaning like ida, right? Very sharp, very clear, right? As we saw earlier over here, what they would do is the concept of tasheed. So they would ease it. They would remove that strangeness, and they would say yida. Or instead of saying mu'minun, they would say mu'minun. Right? This is the concept of ibdal. So this was a concept that we saw even at the time of the Prophet, and we saw with all the different qaba'il and the different tribes. So then you'll really see this in the Qira'aat where certain ruwat, depending on who they learned the Quran from, they pretty much stick to that kind of methodology. So you're going to see as we recite, and we can explain a little bit as we recite, that certain Qur'an will always, for example, do it down, and they'll always say mu'minun instead of mu'minun. They'll always say yu'minun instead of yu'minun, right? They'll always say a'idha instead of a'idha, right? To make things a bit easy. And one thing, just to aside note, is that all this was qualified by the Prophet ﷺ, and the fact that it was revealed in that manner, right? It's not that simply just because they couldn't pronounce it that they just started reciting in any given manner. No, it was revealed in this way to the Prophet, so that's also a very important part to keep in mind. So now what we're going to do, inshallah, alhamdulillah, we've had all of the, the technical part of it has been given to us. So now what we're going to do is we're going to show how people study the science and how they recite the science, and in order to get ijazah and to do a khatam of the Quran, how exactly does that happen? Right? So historically speaking, you have two methodologies. Right? In the past, initially the method that was given is that you would recite the Quran in the same manner that the Ustad is teaching you, right? And you would recite in one manner fully the whole Quran in one way. So for example, we saw the Qira'aat of Ibn Kathir al-Makki, right? So a person would sit with the teacher and he would recite the whole Qira'ah, and he would do Zoom, and he would adhere to just the Qira'ah of Ibn Kathir al-Makki. Then later on, as history progressed and more scholars of the Qira'aat came about, what they started doing was the concept of the Jama'. Jama' means that they combine the different riwayat into one sitting, and you basically will just stop and recite any difference. Right? So for example, like we know how we normally read the Fatiha, you say Maliki Yawmiddin, right? So then you would recite Maliki Yawmiddin, you would stop, and then recite the difference here being Maliki Yawmiddin. Then you would continue reciting. So this tariqah, this methodology of Jama' became more popular later on in history, and you'll see more so that scholars like in Syria typically adhere to the older historical method of doing each singular riwayah, each singular qira'ah. But in terms of what's more logistically effective for a classroom environment and what we study in our madrasa, we do the process and the methodology of Jama', where we recite the different riwayat in one sitting. So what we're going to show right now is that we will recite it, and then anytime there's a difference, we will go back and then reread that difference in according to a different riwayat. Okay?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ألف لام ميم. ألف لام ميم. ذلك الكتاب لا ريب فيه هدى للمتقين.
Now before I continue, as you notice the part ذلك الكتاب لا ريب, I recited once and continue. Right? So that lets us know that amongst the Qur'an, there is an agreement in the fact that there is no other differences in that specific part. Right? So now as we're going to continue, we'll see that I'll stop and then go back to recite other differences that will occur.
فيه هدى للمتقين. فيه هدى للمتقين. فيه هدى للمتقين.
Right? So one thing that we can see here is re-emphasizing that point of to try to make something easy for the ummah. When a person says fihi hudan, right? There are two has coming right after one right after another. So that sometimes may be hard for a person to pronounce, right? Ha and then another ha. So you can see from these other riwayat that are recited afterwards, what they do is they do idgham, and they put both of these has together into one ha that can be pronounced much easier. So we'll continue.
الذين يؤمنون بالغيب ويقيمون الصلاة ومما رزقناهم ينفقون ومما رزقناهم ينفقون الذين يؤمنون بالغيب ويقيمون الصلاة ومما رزقناهم ينفقون الصلاة ومما رزقناهم ينفقون رزقناهم ينفقون والذين يؤمنون بما أنزل إليك وما أنزل من قبلك وبالآخرة هم يوقنون والذين يؤمنون بما أنزل إليك وما أنزل من قبلك وبالآخرة هم يوقنون بما أنزل إليك وما أنزل من قبلك وبالآخرة هم يوقنون يؤمنون بما أنزل إليك وما أنزل من قبلك وبالآخرة هم يوقنون بما أنزل إليك وما أنزل من قبلك وبالآخرة هم يوقنون أولئك على هدى من ربهم أولئك على هدى من ربهم وأولئك هم المفلحون وأولئك هم المفلحون.
So, inshallah, as we've seen over here, we just recited 5 ayat of Surah Al-Baqarah. So you can imagine that you have a majlis where you're reciting to the Ustad and you have to go through the whole Quran in this manner. And most of what we read just now had mainly to do with those consistent rules which we call the usul. Not many of them, there was not really many changes in what we call the furush. And sometimes you see that within just a few words, you will have to recite that part over 15 times, 10 times, right? Because of how many differences there are and to accommodate for all of these differences. So, alhamdulillah, with that, this was the demonstration of the various different qira'at in the tariqah and method of jama' and combining all of the riwayat together. Inshallah, if we have time, if there are any questions, inshallah, we can have a short Q&A if there are anything that needs further.
I had a couple questions, to be honest. I don't know if you have time. First, what method do you guys go about learning this? Do you guys go through like a shatabiya or something? You guys memorize like different poems, or like what method do you guys have for studying all these different qira'at and riwayat?
So yeah, first we studied English, looked at first the main usul, the different rules that are consistent throughout the different qira'at, and then we go through the usul section in the Shafi'iyya, and then we explain all the different lines that mention the rules that are consistent throughout. but we don't memorize the entire Shadiyya and go through the entire thing, but we go through just the usul section, and then we start doing the Jam'a as he just read.
And then for like muraja, if someone had just memorized like one riwayah versus like all these different riwayats, how much more muraja would they have to do, or is there like a method which makes it so that it wouldn't be like a lot more?
So one thing to keep in mind is that a lot of the differences are consistent throughout the Qira'aat. So if you know the rules that are consistent, then you don't really have to remember those every single time, because you know that if you're reading this Qira'at, then the rules are going to be like this. But as for the functional huruf that are like specific words throughout the Quran, then yeah, it might be a little bit difficult. But for example, there's like masahif for each riwayah that sometimes we use to like do muraja'a of the different riwayat, or we can just do a Jam'a if you want to just go throughout the Qira'at. But if you want to read one individual riwayah that you went over, then you can just use that specific mushaf that has that riwayah, or you can use your copy of the mushaf that you marked with the differences. Then that has the differences of whichever Qira'ah you marked. But as for memorizing it, yeah, it might be a little bit difficult to remember every single difference without reviewing it like before reciting it.
And then you guys mentioned like the benefit for the ummah was that different people, different tribes had different difficulties in reciting. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed us with these 7 ahruf, or many ahruf, depending on how you interpret the meaning. But on a more like individual level, besides being blessed with preserving the Quran and preserving the different riwayah of the Quran, what individual benefit does someone get from like learning these different riwayah of the Quran?
Yeah, so the initial benefit that you mentioned, it was mentioned in the hadith that it was for the ease of the ummah, but maybe for an individual level, the way a person can look at it is that when you see all of these different riwayat and qira'at, what it does, it further elucidates on the i'jaz of the Quran. So one of the salient features of the Quran and what makes it is actually a hujjah for the fact that Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is a nabi, is the fact that the Quran is mu'jiz, it's a miracle. So when you look at all the different qira'at and you recite in one meaning, like for example, there's fatabayyan in Surah Al-Hujurat, and there's also fatatabbatun, right? So there's tabayyun and tatabbut, right? So that now when a person is able to go into the linguistics of the Quran, you will derive complementary meanings that give a person more tadabbur that they can do on the Quran. So this is one benefit that on an individual level we can all take it.
So if you're in salah, is it you have to stick with one riwayah when you're in the salah itself, or are you allowed, for example, one rak'ah do this, next rak'ah do that, stuff like this? And also, back up to that question, is when you're doing your muraja, is in salah a way for you to do your muraja?
You want me to repeat the questions, or is it fine just to answer? Okay. So the question was, in terms of reciting in the salah, does a person need to have to do luzum of one riwayah for the whole salah, or are they allowed to choose different riwayat based on the different rak'at of their salah? So this is something that basically, some of these questions they have, like, there's an answer that fuqaha will give you, and there's an answer that the Qur'an will give you, right? Because when you talk about just straight up permissibility, then there's one answer. But then if you talk about what the Qur'an typically do, those who are involved in this science, they'll typically tell you that just for those, for example, nowadays some of the Qur'an don't even recommend that you need a different riwayah from your whatever your city will read. They don't even recommend that you recite that in the salah, because there's a fear, most people are not aware of this. So then when you recite like that, then they may start rejecting what you recited, and as was mentioned in the PowerPoint, this is going to be detrimental. So from one perspective, they look at it like that if you recite one riwayah in the first rak'ah, and you recite a different riwayah in the second rak'ah, then it may cause more confusion to people. So they, from the Qur'an, their perspective, they wouldn't recommend it, that you do this. But if it's a setting where people are a little bit more aware, then that may change the discussion. But in accordance to what the Fuqaha would say, it would be permissible to do that. The validity of the salah would remain valid if a person did recite one riwayah in one rak'ah and another riwayah in another rak'ah. And then your second question, what some Qur'an do is that they'll recite in different riwayahs in their tarawih. So, for example, one year they may recite in house regularly, and then maybe their tahajjud salah they'll recite in a different riwayah, maybe Welsh or Qur'an or something like that, just to keep it kind of fresh in his mind.
Is it possible if you can recite a few ayats in Warsh and Qanun, if you have time?
Maybe we could just, if there's any more questions, because if I don't want to recite and then stop again to like ask questions, so we could do that. If there are more questions.
Even if you start with a 7A. Before that. So in house, we don't do it SK, right?
So the question was, so the question was, in Hafs, do we do tasheer? There's only one place in the whole riwayah of Hafs that he will do it, in Surah Al-Fussilat, A'jami wa Arabi. So there's two hamzas that come. One has tahqiq, the second one has tasheer. So you would say and the second one would have tasheer, you would say So A'jami wa Arabi. So this is the only place in Hafs that has tasheer. And when you see these kind of situations where there's one place in the whole Quran that Qari or Rawi recites in a certain way, that just shows you that the main qualifying factor for all of these riwayat is that they were revealed in this manner, and there is a proper sanad from the teacher all the way to Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. That no person is mixing up one riwayah with something that they're just putting in their opinion or something that they did not hear. They're reciting it exactly how they heard it from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and you'll even see that they say that Imam Abu Abdul Rahman as-Sunani, he was the most knowledgeable of the recitation of Ali radiallahu anhu, and then the most knowledgeable of Imam Abu Amr as-Sunani was Imam Asim, and the most knowledgeable of Imam Asim's riwayah was Imam Hafs. And even the Shafi'i, he says, وَحَفْسٌ وَبِالْإِتْقَانِ كَانَ مُفَضَّلًا, like he had a lot of itqan in that recitation. So you can see these names here, and you'll also see that in the same hadith that we quoted, in the chain, you'll see the same people there. So that just shows you all the inayah and the focus that they had when it comes to the Qira'aat in the Quran. Right, so you see over there Asim, then you see Zayd bin Quraysh, right, Ubay bin Ka'b, and that same chain that comes up over here. Sorry, that was kind of a tangent, but any other questions?
Like for you, I guess you could each choose one question. Which Qira'at do you like the most? And also like in our time, which like recital do you like? Do you enjoy listening to for different Qira'at?
In terms of, I'll answer the second one first. I don't know if I really have a favorite reciter at the moment. I think it kind of changes here and there. I kind of like the older reciters like Qusari, rahimahullah, Nishawi, rahimahullah, and Muhammad Ayyub, rahimahullah. So I guess, I don't know if you consider all of them old school, but those classical reciters. And in terms of, this is like a kind of a tricky question because a lot of Qur'an do not like to have a conversation on which riwayah they like over another, because they don't like to tafdeel of one riwayah over another, because as we saw back in that means that all of them were recited to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So to say like this one is better than that, I know that's not what you're asking, but usually like this kind of conversation is kind of avoided sometimes just because it's a bit difficult to navigate. I think maybe some people like they can say they like listening to Warsh more just because it's more unique. They haven't heard like those differences that often. Same thing with the riwayah Imam Khalaf and Hamza. A lot of people will like to listen to that because all of the differences, it's so unique from
Hafs in the sense that you have so many different ways that he's making differences, like he's doing stopping at the Hamza, he's doing Imala, saying Istaway, all those different things. So some people will go that way and say that, okay, yeah, I like reciting in Welsh or I like reciting in Hamza because of the fact that there's so many more differences that I can practice on that aren't found in Hafs and Hamza.
Which Qur'an do you like?
Yeah, I say the same thing that he said. I don't know.
Do you by chance know the hukum behind this ayah in the Quran in Surah Al-Hujurat when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu in ja'akum fasiqun binaba'in fatabayyan, and then there is another ayah that says fatathabbatu. So which kind of citation is that?
That's an example of fellowship huruf where that is a valid qira'ah, and that's an example of fellowship huruf where that's just like a one-off difference, and it is a valid qira'ah. That's the example. Is there any other question?
Inshallah, maybe one or two more questions, inshallah.
Is the different pronunciation of like in Surah Hud and Yusuf, Majreha and is it consistent in different riwayat or just for Hafs like that?
No, it's for Majliha, not all the Qur'an they do that, but for the other ones they do. It's for almost all Qur'an they do have that difference. But for Majliha, there's like, for example, some do Mujalaha, or some, yeah, so it's not consistent.
Inshallah, one more question. خلاص, I'll ask. Subhanallah. Yeah, it's escaping from my mind. Somebody else say something.
What advice would you give to like just general Muslims? You know, maybe they don't memorize just Amma yet. Like, what encouragement would you give them with the Quran?
So the most important thing I would say is to learn tajweed, because some people they emphasize doing hifz of the whole Quran, but the main thing is tajweed, because reading the Quran with tajweed is tough, right? So memorizing the entire Quran is not necessarily an obligation, but whatever you know, reciting that with tajweed so that your salah is valid, reciting it as it was revealed, that is necessary upon every single Muslim. So I would say that just go to a local qari or some teacher that can teach you tajweed, and even if you're not able to memorize more than a few ajza, even less than that, even just one, but as long as you have proper tajweed, I would say that's the most important thing that most people should start with.
So there's two ayat that I always hear that was curious if that's Qira'aat. So in Surah Yusuf, وَقَالَتْ هَيَّأْتَ لَكْ قَالَتْ هُؤْتَ لَكْ, and the other ones. Are those different Qira'ats?
Yeah, that famous book, that those are all valid. Yeah. That's the example of what he was mentioning, that sometimes you read one word like about 10 times because there's so many ways of reading it.
Another one is the أنا آتيك به jinn and slipped my mind what surah it was. أنا آتيك أنا آتيك.
Yeah, that's also valid. Yeah.
But which ones are they? I was just curious because I always hear it, but it's like, yeah, what kind of Qira'at?
So that was the one is قال عفريت من الجنين أنا آتي. That one is Imam Nafi', I believe. So then Imam Warsh will extend it, he'll say أنا آتيك. So whenever you hear that specific where Ana becomes Ana, it's usually going to be the Imam Nafi', and moreover it will be Imam Warsh who's extending it that long. And then with the Haytu, the Hita, we have to just double check all the names because there might be like two that are reciting the same way, and then one is reciting differently.
So some of them just to feed the man.
Yes.
So the one that says فَتَثَبَّتُوا, which one is that?
But that's Hamza.
Hamza.
That was a cool question.
No, so according to most scholars, ahruf and qira'at are not the same thing because according to all the ulama, there are 10 qira'at that are mutawatir, that are tabi'd from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So qira'at, ahruf does not mean qira'at because, like as I mentioned, ahruf, one of the main interpretations is that it refers to 7 categories of differences. So another one is that 7 just in Arabic, 7 means a lot, or kathra. So yeah, it's not.
You already answered for the like reciting in Salah, but if you are just doing munaja, can we change the riwayah and after like ending munaya and change it to another?
Yeah, as it was mentioned before, it's completely valid because it's all Quran. But many of the ulama say it's against adab because if you want to like recite like by one time, you should try to stick to one qira'ah because I mean just the adab just against that. But still completely valid because it's all Quran.
So the last one. So the Qur'an is 7 Qira'at and the Sughra is 3. Because I do here, Qira'at al-Ashr. So which one is Sughra and Kubra?
Yeah, so they're basically the reason they have different names is because of how the methodology of how the books were laid out. So then you have Qira'at al-Sab'a, 7, right? And there was one point in time where one book was made and a lot of inayah and particularly was given to 7 of them. And it wasn't to say that these are the only 7, it was just that the person who authored the book had the ijazat in these 7 and he wanted to give like importance to these 7 specifically. Because it was at a time where a lot of people were teaching stuff that was not considered a valid qira'ah. Thereafter, years later, Imam Ibn al-Jazari came and he not added meaning that they were not there before, but he just further clarified that these 3 Qur'an also are in the same category with these 7 and they should be studied as well. Similarly, everybody should know about this, right? Because it wasn't as well known at that time because people only concentrated on that book that was teaching those 7. So then at that point now you have what they call al-Qira'at al-Ashr, al-Surah, right? Then thereafter, Imam Ibn al-Jazari made another book called Al-Nashr fi al-Qira'at al-Ashr, where he further expounded on the students of the students. Like we saw over here that you have students, right? So you see Asim and Kufi, then you have Shu'bah and Hafs. But these people, Shu'bah and Hafs, they also have students, right? So then when you look at all these students and how it branches out into more and more, Imam, like there's over like 1,000 riwayat or like turuq as they call it. So then when you look at all those turuq and how these students have more and more students, then that's where they call it the Qira'at al-Ashr al-Kubra. Because then now you have this riwayat from, like for example, you have Hafs, and what we read is Hafs in the Tariq of Shafi'iyya. Then there's other ones in the Tariq of Misbah. So that's what they call getting into discussion of Qira'at al-Ashr al-Kubra.
Was mentioned for giving us an opportunity to discuss this noble topic, inshallah. And we thank everyone for listening,
Jazakumullah khair for our honorable guest, Jazakumullah khair, Faisal and Fatima, Jazakumullah khair for enlightening us really on this very technical topic that if we were not understanding of, it would be very confusing for us. So we thank you again, Jazakumullah khair, for coming out and giving us this great presentation and demonstration. Jazakumullah khair. Inshallah, for the rest of the time, inshallah, we have a packed night, inshallah, for the rest of the night. Our Qur'an will be back, inshallah, for Qiyam. Qiyam will be at around 3:45. 3:45 will be Qiyam, inshallah, for those who are coming to join us for Qiyam. Inshallah, they'll be in different Qira'ah, inshallah, at 3:45. And then Suhoor will be served at 5:45 because there's a time change to daylight savings time, inshallah. So for now, we will have some short activities with the brothers on the TV. I think one of our brothers prepared something for us, so we may have a short activity. Inshallah, we'll see our Qur'an again. Jazakumullah khair. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.